Hi, Dane Ryan here at
Green Christendom.
Today we're going to be talking about the just wage as more than prudential teaching. The First Vatican Council teaches that the Church's supreme magisterial authority extends to teaching on both faith and morals. We need to know the saving faith, who Jesus Christ is and what he's done for us. And he is not only the truth, but also the way and the life. And thus we must know how to follow in his footsteps, to live in his way. Thus the Church must be able to teach not only on doctrine pertaining to the faith, but also must be able to teach on morals, which relate to our living the way of salvation. We need to keep in mind that morality does not just pertain to individual types of action, but also involves us as social beings. The philosopher who first wrote on morality or ethics as a distinct subject, Aristotle, said that man is a politikon zon, a political animal. We sometimes translate it as social animal. Both terms, I think, have their usefulness. But morality extends to more than individual and private matters. We kind of tend to associate it with those because we largely associate the Church's teaching on morality often with sexual matters. These two, I would say, have a social dimension. God created woman after he said that it is not good for man to be alone, and man and woman become one flesh, and that's the way that they fulfill the primordial commandment of God to be fertile and multiply. That's a pretty important social task and a pretty important thing for the lives and justice to the parties involved. Thus the Church's teaching on marriage as the way to fulfill that has fundamental relations to justice to husbands, wives, and children. But we also need to realize that morality pertains to social matters like politics and economics. And so the Church's ability to teach extends to those matters. We sometimes tend to think of teaching with regards to these matters as merely prudential, because the Second Vatican Council mentioned that the Church doesn't endorse a single economic or political system. It's a misinterpretation, however, to say that that means that it doesn't have teaching, even fundamental moral teaching, on what's acceptable in those areas. And I think what we're going to be talking about today, the just wage, is a fundamental matter of moral principles, as shown by the way that Leo XIII talks about it, and its reiteration in all the popes who have touched on these kinds of things since him. Some people, especially those who like our modern capitalist free market economy, think that in matters like wages, only economic factors should be taken into consideration. But the economy involves human beings. Thus, it can't be considered a merely neutral science. It's certainly not a hard science, even because it involves the complex motivations of the complex spiritual animal that is man. Our reason, our passions, our freedom are all involved in our economic decision making. And those will depend on whether a man is virtuous or vicious, and whether society has a tendency more towards virtue or vice. And certain economic ways can foster a path towards virtue or vice. All human action is moral action. It is action that can tend either towards the good or towards what is not the full good, what is evil. So, let's see what Pope Leo XIII, in his classical encyclical on the Church's social and economic teaching, Rerum Novarum, teaches concerning the just wage. First, to contextualize, here's a couple of passages from the Second Vatican Council on the more than economic, moral, and human considerations we need to take into consideration in economic matters. In the economic and social realms too, the dignity and complete vocation of the human person and the welfare of society as a whole are to be respected and promoted. For man is the source, the center, and the purpose of all economic and social life. Gaudium et Spes 63. Hence the norm of human activity is this, that in accord with the divine plan and will, it harmonize with the genuine good of the human race, and that it allow men as individuals and as members of society to pursue their total vocation and fulfill it. So, the economy involves the human person, and it must be oriented towards the human person and towards human society and to the proper fulfillment of both individuals and societies. So, Leo XIII. Let the working man and the employer make free agreements, and in particular, let them agree freely as to wages. Nevertheless, there underlies a dictate of natural justice, more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man, namely, that the wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. If through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the workman accept harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice. Pretty strong words from Leo XIII. He speaks of justice and nature as the factors here. He doesn't speak of this as a merely prudential thing. He speaks of this as involving principles of the natural moral law and of natural justice. And he speaks of violence and injustice against a man if he is afforded less. How are we to understand this teaching? Well, in an agreement for a wage, there are two human factors to be taken into consideration. There is the ends that a man is seeking when he seeks employment. What does he seek? He seeks to support himself and his family. Otherwise, he wouldn't seek work in the first place. That's the purpose of working for a wage. Obviously, it's also to do for the employer to make money for his company, and for the employer to, from that profit, support his own family. But these human factors need to be taken into consideration, and not merely economic factors. And in a job with decently hard work and decently long hours, an employer cannot provide this, then it is not of proper utility to society that such a task be performed. Now, in the given circumstances, whose responsibility is this primarily? Is it the employer's? Is it the state? Well, let's see what Leo has to say as he goes on. In these and similar questions, however, such as, for example, the hours of labor in different trades, the sanitary precautions to be observed in factories and workshops, in order to supersede undue interference on the part of the state, especially as circumstances, times, and localities differ so widely, it is advisable that recourse be had to societies or boards, such as we shall mention presently, or to some other mode of safeguarding the interest of the wage earners, the state being appealed to should circumstances require for its sanction and protection. So, Leo doesn't want to involve the state too heavily. So, the state, since the French Revolution, had been taking, according to the church's teaching, especially as articulated by Leo and later by Pius IX, on much more than the rights that belong to it, interfering with individuals and families especially. And so he's wary of the state. And in the present, individual employers, how well can they guarantee it? Especially if they have competition and they need to be thinking of staying in business in the first place in a society that's not completely oriented to it. Are they allowed to do the best they can in order to help people have something and to keep afloat? I don't know. But the fundamental teaching on just wage is clear. Pope Leo grounds this teaching both in reason. He was, after all, the Pope who also came out with an encyclical on the restoration of Christian philosophy according to the mind of one of the greatest thinkers of concerning the faith and reason as well, St. Thomas Aquinas, Aeterni Patris. was the title of the encyclical. He has a good deal of grounding also in Scripture and in the Fathers. He quotes, for instance, Scripture where it talks about God being angry, those who deny the worker their wages, and interpreted more broadly, not giving them a just wage can be included in that. And all the popes since have reaffirmed that. So, for instance, St. John Paul II in Laborum Exercens says, 19, says, just remuneration for the work of an adult who is responsible for a family means remuneration which will suffice for establishing and properly maintaining a family and for providing security for its future. He goes on to suggest another way that a family's income might be supplemented by giving a kind of allowance for a mother to stay home, so that the requirement that they not have to enter the labor force, which is also another element of the church's teaching, could be achieved in a different way. I think this idea stands in a bit of tension in terms of the more classical paradigm articulated, for instance, by Leo XIII and by Pius IX, Rerum Novarum and in Quadragesimo Anno, that the state's welfare function should be emergency and temporary. And this would seem to be a pretty intense and permanent type welfare function. So I might have some problem with that as a plausible solution. Anyhow, relating the church's teaching on just wages to the church's broader social teaching and some stuff that I talked about in my earlier video on distributism or proprietarianism as a philosophy seeking to embody the church's economic teaching. It is an end of the human person who's the father of a family to provide for himself and his children. We also have an inclination to do that ourselves and with a relative autonomy. As Scripture talks about, one of the things that the just man would be blessed with, you shall eat of the fruit of the labor of your hands. So, Leo XIII also talks about this in relation to, and says that a just wage should not only provide for the sustenance of a man and his family in the present, but also should eventually enable him to not have to be an employee and to be able to eat of the fruit of the labor of his own hands. So, what the company is doing should not be to basically keep the man in bondage for life. To wages and to employment. If a working man's wages be sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and children, he will find it easy, if he be a sensible man, to practice thrift, and he will not fail, by cutting down expenses, to put by some little savings, and thus secure a modest source of income. Nature itself would urge him to this. We have seen that this great labor question cannot be solved save by assuming as a principle that private ownership must be held sacred and inviolable. The law, therefore, should favor ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the people to become owners. That is, owners of their own livelihood, not simply like owners of their house or what have you. Rerum Novarum 46. And here's some of the benefits that he says could follow from this. If working people can be encouraged to look forward to obtaining a share in the land, the consequence will be that the gulf between vast wealth and sheer poverty will be bridged over, and the respective classes will be brought nearer to one another. A further consequence of this will result in the greater abundance of the fruits of the earth. Men always work harder and more readily when they work on that which belongs to them. Nay, they learn to love the very soil that yields in response to the labor of their hands, not only food to eat, but an abundance of good things for themselves and those that are dear to them. That such a spirit of willing labor would add to the produce of the earth and to the wealth of the community is self-evident. And a third advantage would spring from this. Men would cling to the country in which they were born, for no one would exchange his country for a foreign land, if his own afforded him the means of living a decent and happy life. Rerum Novarum 47. So, in terms of the broader purposes of the economy, groundedness of this kind of teaching, both in scripture and tradition, as well as in reason and the natural law, I am going to conclude with these words from the Second Vatican Council. For man, created in God's image, received a mandate to subject to himself the earth and all it contains, and to govern the world with justice and holiness. A mandate to relate himself and the totality of things to him who is to be acknowledged as the Lord and Creator of all. Thus, by the subjection of all things to man, the name of God would be wonderful in all the earth. This mandate concerns the whole of everyday activity as well, for while providing the substance of life for themselves and their families, men and women are performing their activities in a way which appropriately benefits society. They can justly consider that by their labor they are unfolding the Creator's work, consulting the advantage of their brother men, and are contributing to their personal industry to the realization and history of the divine plan. Thus far from thinking that works produced by man's own talent and energy are in opposition to God's power, and that the rational creature exists as a kind of rival to the Creator, Christians are convinced that the triumphs of the human race are a sign of God's grace and the flowering of his own mysterious design. For the greater man's power becomes, the farther his individual and community responsibilities extend. Hence it is clear that men are not deterred by the Christian message from building up the world, or impelled to neglect the welfare of their fellows, but that they are rather more stringently bound to do these very things. Gaudium et Spes 34. So everybody have a good day, and God bless y'all, everyone, from Green Christendom. So remember, if thou dost like this video, liketh it. If thou likest this channel, subscribeth. And if thou think that this would be helpful to your family and friends, shareth it on social media. And if thou hath feedback, commentest.